Hello.
From Boca to see Dad and the whole group here. I'd like to introduce Missy, who is both a rescue and a therapy dog. And Missy will introduce Bud almost. But guys, Bud is going to talk about his book called The Reluctant Sailor. He says all his stories are true and they're funny. He wrote this book a few years ago. I'll just wait here. I'd like to quote from something. This is from his website because I liked it a lot. When I page through it now, I see something a little different than the humor I intended. I was surprised to understand that I am actually proud of my service to my country. There is a lingering sense of accomplishment and commitment that shows in between the lines. I was actually part of the greatest generation, and it humbles me to be associated with 500,000 Jewish servicemen and women who pledged their very lives then to defend our country that was at that time under attack by the Axis powers. I think that's such a special thing to have said. And with that, I'd like to introduce my Gottesman, who, by the way, changed an appointment for his regular dialysis to be with us today. So we're really appreciative. But it's yours. This is not in the right way to change.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. And I'm very glad not to be in dialysis today.
Well, I don't know whether you're going to need this.
Well, can everyone hear me?
I think it might be.
All those who can hear me, raise your hand.
No, you're fine.
No hands.
Nobody can hear me.
No hands. I think you're going to have to talk. I'm afraid you're going to have to talk.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yay!
I can hear me too. And the question is, why did I write a book? You might think that writing a book is a way to make money. A lot of people have that conception. It's not true. There are people that write a book, but we're not all Joe Rollins. Joe Rollins is the lady that wrote the Harry Potter books. And she turned out to be, I think, one of the most, second richest woman in the world. And coming from poverty. She was on welfare when she wrote the first book. But that's about as likely to happen as winning the lottery in every state and only buying one ticket. That's the way that happens. It's very, very weird and strange. But there's always somebody. I married, and my wonderful wife, Elaine, and I married. And we had 4 daughters. And the kids used to hear the stories when I would tell them to friends, and they would start telling the same stories to their friends. And as I listened, I heard they didn't have all the facts exactly correct. So they would correct them and tell them, no, that's not exactly the way it happened. If you want to tell a story, this is what happened. Tell them the real version. Well, it didn't seem to take. They would still get the stories wrong. And they're pretty smart kids. So I figured I had to write them down. So I started writing down a few stories here and a few stories there. And then through the years, like 50 years later, I'm still telling the stories and having a lot of fun doing it, and decided that I better write them down. So I started writing the stories down. And I had a computer then, so it made it a lot easier to do, but I lost my eyesight. So I wrote them in a very difficult manner. I had to use a magnifying glass hunched over the monitor so I could see what I was typing. And to correct it, I had to do the same thing. It was quite a painstaking thing to do, but I did it. And after I had a number of stories written, my niece, who is a writer, she excited about the stories, and she said, you've got to make a book out of them. So I had to write more stories. And it was just so interesting how easily it came back to me 50 years later. I remembered all the details of all these stories. Partly because I used to tell them, and partly because when I started typing it, it slowed down enough, because I typed very slowly. I could remember all the details. It just came right back. It's flooding into my memory. So when I had 180 pages written, my niece said, you got to make a book out of it now. And we did. Okay. How many people would like to write a book someday? There we go. A little more interest. Well, I just want to tell you that today is the best time in the world to write a book. Computers are terrific. They make writing so easy. Even if you can't see, if you have a visual problem like I do, you can still write a book. There are programs available. One of them is called Zoom Text, which enlarges the type that big so I can see it. And it also reads for you as you type. It tells you the letter that you typed. It tells you it reads the word after you type it. And then you can also set it just to read back what you have typed. So it eliminates the backache of going like this. So now we have to check into publishers. And if you think a publisher is there to make you rich and to publish your book, you're wrong. Publishers are there for one reason, and that is to make money. If they can make money on your book, they're very willing to do it. But you have to sign up with a publisher. And that means that you take your book, it's your baby, your child that you gave birth to, and you give it to the publisher, and he says, I'm going to give you 5 or 10% of the profits. It doesn't sound like very much, but it's probably the best way to go for people that have their book accepted by a publisher. And that's not easy to do. And the other way to go is to publish it yourself. And that's what I elected to do because my niece, Ami Sims, had published 6 or 7 books of her own already on quilting. So she said, I will publish your book for you. And that made it a little bit easier, plus the fact that she was doing an email newsletter to 20,000 quilters across the country. So she said, I will mention your book in my newsletter. So I said, well, that's a pretty good deal. So that's what we did. We published the book. We had it proofread. All of my kids proofread it. My wife proofread it. Our friends proofread it. And then we hired a professional proofreader that Ami had. And we still got one mistake in the book on page 95. But that's a big job to do. And when a publisher does it for you, there's an enormous cost involved. And people that help me are many, many people. My grandson, Zachary Noble, did the photography for the cover. My granddaughter, Dana Reed, did the cover. He did the graphic design and designed the cover. And of course, they all helped to proofread. And I became, in my opinion, a successful writer. I was so successful that even a friend of ours, Vivian Sander, who was in the Brandeis chapter in Palm Gardens, wanted to publish her memoirs. So she approached me and asked me if I would help her. So I said, sure. And I related basically what I told you now. And she said, well, 1,600 books. I don't want to order any books. She did not want to commit to anything. So I said, well, the other choice is I can run a couple off on my computer. And this is the result of that. This is Vivian Sadler's book. So I printed them all for her. And she gave them away to her family members, and that was the end of that. But it was very successful for Vivian. Vivian was very tickled with it. She passed away several months later, maybe 6 or 7 months later. And I am so glad to have had a part in preserving her memoirs, and her memories, and her wit in that book that her family now has. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine lives across the street, was in the Navy, same time I was. He's my age, 83. And he said he wanted to write a book too, like I did. But I ran into the same obstacle. He didn't want to commit to a large purchase. And he said, would you print yours on, could you print my book on your computer too? So I said, yeah, sure. Well, I love Nick, and I love Vivian, and I love doing it for both of them, but it was a horrendous job. Nick was a high school graduate of South Buffalo High School, and as a high school graduate, his English was not what you would expect, but it was charming. He had a lot of dems and does, and a lot of double negatives, and he would sit next to me when I was on the computer, because he would not type. He was not computer literate, and he did not know to type. So he would sit next to me and I would type, and he would try to tell me the stories. It became very difficult because he couldn't hang them all together. And I was having a lot of problems with him, and then we brought out the old pictures that he had, some of them when he was a baby, some of them when he was in his teens, and some of them when he was in the Navy. And he brought out the pictures, and when he started talking to me about the pictures, all of a sudden, this man became eloquent. He was telling me everything about what happened, because he was looking at the picture instead of trying to talk, instead of trying to write a book. He's talking to me and telling me about the pictures. So I got out a tape recorder, and I tape recorded it. And that's how that book finally came to pass. And I printed it myself, and because when you print a book on a computer, and you have more than, if you have that many pages, the outside page is shorter than the inside page when you fold it. So it's not a very neat looking book. So I made 2 books for it. Part 1 and Part 2. And he's thrilled with it, and he had his pictures, and we blew them up and put them on here. He's got pictures in his books, some of his old pictures. Now, I got right out of boot camp, and I went on to the brand new destroyer called the USS Robert L. Wilson. It was a state-of-the-art then. It was a violent machine. It was a killer. It was so exciting. It was a fantastic ship. And I was on that. It was brand new, and I was on shakedown cruise. Shakedown cruises, when they test the ship and the men, what they did is they ran us 4 hours on duty and 4 hours off duty.